Okay, the next section is going to be regarding impact fees, or what we call SIDs and LIDs, Special Improvement District or Limited Improvement District. But these are fees that are placed on a homeowner due to the community being built by the developers, such as parks, sidewalks, and all the infrastructure. The seller of any property must give notice of any impact fees that may be imposed upon the buyer. An impact fee is a charge imposed by a local government or on new development, i.e. the construction or reconstruction or redevelopment, relocation or enlargement of any structure which increases the number of service to the unit, to finance some of the cost attributable to the new development. Again, to put in the infrastructure like the sidewalks, parks, all that kind of stuff, they pass on the cost to the new buyer. Who must provide the disclosure? A seller who has knowledge of the impact fee must give written notice to the buyer, including the amount of the impact fee and the name of the local government imposing the fee. The notice must be provided to the buyer before the property is conveyed, and if the seller fails to give this notice, the seller is liable to the buyer for the amount of the impact fee. Now, this is normally just in a written statement, such as you purchase a new home. It's normally in a written statement to the buyer. Okay, liens. The purpose of the disclosure for liens or for deferred taxes: if there are deferred taxes that have not been paid at the time the property is sold or transferred, the buyer must be notified in writing that there is a lien for deferred taxes on the property. The seller must notify the buyer of the lien, and the lien must be disclosed at the time the property is sold or transferred. The owner of the property, on the date the deferred taxes become due, is liable for the deferred taxes. Okay? Now, manufactured housing. The state of Nevada has requirements regarding disclosures of manufactured housing. The purpose of the disclosure of used manufactured / mobile home disclosure is to make sure the buyer is aware that a used manufactured mobile home that has not been converted to real property is personal property and subject to personal property tax, not real property tax. The real estate licensee shall provide the form to the purchaser as soon as practicable, but before the title is transferred. In other words, if you have a client buying a piece of land and there's a manufactured home on there that has not been converted to real property, you have to use this disclosure, and it's your responsibility as their agent to give them this disclosure. The disclosure also informs the purchaser that the title will not pass unless the county assessor's endorsement is placed on the face of the title, verifying the taxes have been paid in full. The disclosure also instructs the consumer to submit certain documents to Nevada's Manufactured Housing Division and the county assessors within 45 days after the sale is complete and before the certificate of ownership will be issued. Again, manufactured housing for manufactured home parks. The purpose of this disclosure relating to the placing or buying a manufactured home or mobile home in a manufactured home park is to make the buyer aware that they may be subject to approval of the landlord of the manufactured home park if the manufactured or mobile home will remain in the park. Who must provide a disclosure? If the landlord requires approval of a prospective buyer and tenant, the landlord must post a sign which is clearly readable and at the entrance of the park, which advises the consumer that before a manufactured home in a park is sold, the buyer and tenant must be approved by the landlord. A few additional information. If the property will remain in a manufactured home park, make sure you have a lease agreement with the park manager and that you know the park rules. Remember, the seller or a manufactured home dealer cannot promise that you'll be accepted as a tenant in a particular manufactured home park. You must apply for the lease yourself, and you should do so before finalizing the purchase of your home. The landlord must approve or deny a completed application from a prospective buyer and tenant within 10 days after the date of application submitted. Open range disclosure. This is an important form. If your client somewhere, let's just say in rural Nevada, it doesn't have to be rural, but let's say it's rural. Next to their property, they may be buying an acre or two property, and next to it, there are cattle that are allowed to roam or other type of livestock. You might have to have an open range disclosure. The purpose of the open range disclosure is to inform the prospective buyer of a home or an improvement or unimproved lot adjacent to open range that livestock are permitted to graze and roam on that property. So a seller must disclose in writing to the potential buyer of property adjacent to the open range that livestock grazing on the open range are permitted to enter the property, and that the parcel may be subject to county or state claims of right-of-way. The disclosure must be provided to the potential buyer with the requirement that the buyer sign the disclosure form acknowledging the date of receipt of the original disclosure document before the sales agreement is signed. So a little bit of additional information here. The disclosure acknowledges fencing the property to keep livestock out and recognizes the property owner entitlement to damages if livestock entered a fenced property, but warns against harming roaming livestock even on a fenced property. So just because the cattle get on your property doesn't mean you can harm them. Okay. The law requires that the seller retain a copy of the disclosure document and that has been signed by the buyer, acknowledging that the date of receipt of the document. Provide a copy to the buyer and record the original disclosure document with the buyer's signature and the seller's notarized signature in the office of the county recorder in the county where the property is located. That form has to be notarized. It's very important. Private transfer fee obligation. The purpose of this disclosure is to make a buyer aware that the property is subject to private transfer fee. Now, the private transfer fee will require the buyer, upon conveyance of the property by the seller, to pay either a one-time fixed amount or a one-time percentage of the purchase price to a third-party payee. This is pretty confusing, but the seller of a property that is subject to a private transfer fee must provide a disclosure as a written statement to the disclosures that discloses the existence of the private transfer fee. Okay, the disclosure must be provided to the potential buyer before the conveyance of the property. Now, if it has a private transfer fee obligation, what this means is that the seller A is selling to buyer B. Okay. However, when he does that, there may be a fee that's owed to the original seller C. All right, and so that's the private transfer fee obligation. It's on the deed. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of places that require this, but mostly in northern Nevada, but it is on there. And there are some here in Las Vegas. Okay. The notice regarding the existence of a private transfer fee in the seller's disclosure must be in the following form. A private transfer fee obligation has been created with respect to this property. The private transfer fee obligation may lower the value of this property. The laws of the state prohibit the enforcement of certain private transfer fee obligations that are created on or after May 20th, 2011. So if the private transfer fee was completed or made after May 20th, 2011, it's not legal. Most of these date back in a long time ago. All right. Obligations impose certain notice requirements with respect to private transfer fee obligations that were created before May 20th, 2011. Okay. So water and sewer. So the purpose of a disclosure relating to water and sewer is to inform the buyer of a previously unsold home, a new home, or improved lot of public utility rates when the service is more for 25 but fewer than 2,000 customers. So like a new development, for example, a new subdivision. All right. Who must provide a disclosure? The seller must provide a notice which shows the current project rates in a conspicuous place on the property. When is it due? The notice must be posted and a copy provided to the buyer before the home is sold. And a notice must contain the name, address, telephone number, and the public utility of the division and the Division of Consumer Complaint Resolution of the Public Utility Commission of Nevada. In other words, any new developer has to disclose what the water and sewer rates are going to be at that time. So pool safety and drowning prevention. This is a required disclosure for the Southern Nevada Health District. And drowning prevention disclosures is to make the buyer aware of the risk of death of drowning in private pools, particularly for children 4 years or younger. This is not that old of a disclosure, and actually by signing for this book, you're signing for this disclosure. But the information is provided in by the Nevada Real Estate Division in agreement with the Southern Nevada Health District to promote Southern Nevada Health District's efforts to inform the public on drowning prevention. When is it due? It's due, it must be provided to the buyer prior to sales agreement is signed by way of the residential disclosure guide, which is contained in. The buyer is advised to visit Southern Nevada Health District website. In other words, when you sign for the residential disclosure guide, you're signing for the pool safety disclosure, okay? All right, a few miscellaneous disclosures. Some brokerages will require this, and then some are a city state. Airport noise. Most of us have an airport noise disclosure, all right? It just says basically that, hey, you're living around airports, you're gonna hear an airplane once in a while. There are airports all over Las Vegas, for example, so you're gonna hear different areas. Building and zoning codes. So it needs to be disclosed, especially if you're buying a new property, what the zoning is of that property. And that'll be disclosed in a new home. All right, but the purpose of the building and zoning disclosure is to inform a buyer of transportation of beltways and or planned anticipated land use within a proximity of a subject property. In other words, what are the codes, what are the zonings, are there commercial, gaming, all these kind of things, okay? Environmental hazards. Although a seller is required to disclose the presence of environmental hazards, a statement that the seller is not aware of a defect or hazard does not mean that it does not exist. It is the buyer's responsibility to be informed and take additional steps to further investigate. So remember, it's the buyer's responsibility. If you want a radon inspection, get one. If you want a methamphetamine inspection, get one. A mold inspection, you would get one. Wood burning devices, such as fireplaces, older fireplaces, if you want an inspection, you need to get one. Okay. Same with all these well inspection, septic inspection. Some of these may be required by typical loan requirements, such as FHA, but some of them may not be. Okay. Gaming. Initial purchaser in a new construction only. You only get a gaming zone disclosure if you're buying a new home. That's it. There's none for resale. Okay, home inspections. When obtaining an FHA insured loan, this disclosure informs the buyer about the limits of Federal Housing Administration appraisal inspection and suggests the buyer obtain a home inspection to evaluate the physical condition of the property prior to their purchase. The form is entitled, "For Your Protection, Get a Home Inspection." It's mandatory on all FHA loans, but it's not necessarily mandatory on other types of loans, although most of us tend to use it anyway, okay? Military activities. There can be disclosures of any military activities such as a bombing range or an Air Force base and certain things like that, depending on where you live, okay? There are places in Nevada that are open bombing ranges. Obviously, they're not selling houses there, but you may want to know that you're living fairly close to one, okay? Licensee and disclosures. In Nevada, the Consent to Act form, which we talked about in Part 1, and the Duties Owed form we talked about in Part 1, okay, are required to disclose information such as his or her relationship to one or more parties in the transaction. Again, if you're going to represent both parties, you must have a Duties Owed signed by both parties, and you must have a Consent to Act form signed, okay? Road Maintenance District. The sale of a residential property within a road maintenance district is prohibited unless the seller provides notice to the purchaser, including the amount of assessments for the last 2 years. If the district has been in existence less than 2 years before the notice is provided to the purchaser, then the amount of the assessment shall be given for the period since the district was created. So if you're going to get assessed for repairing the roads, you need to know how much that's going to be. Soils report on new construction. If you're buying a new construction, they're going to give you a soils report. This report's going to tell you if the property is on expansive soil or not. Hopefully it's not. And tell you all the information from the engineers like that. Okay, residential disclosure guide. Again, you must sign for the residential disclosure guide. This is the only acceptable form. You will see that there are many other places, but the division requires this form to be signed by your client.